I'm Richard Parker. I'm the chair of West Midlands LFIG, and I'd just like to say how delighted I am that we're able to host with Aston University the annual LFIG lecture this evening with Anneliese Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor. For those of you new to LFIG, LFIG is an organisation that aims to build a bridge between the Shadow Front Bench and the wider business community that includes academic institutions and also the not-for-profit sector. It really aims to engage with key stakeholders beyond the boundaries of party politics. Before Anneliese is introduced this evening, I'd just like to thank Professor Alec Cameron and his team at Aston for hosting the event. LFIG has had a long association with Aston on events like this, and certainly I can remember recent events with Chuck Umuna and Hilary Benn that were very well received. We're also very pleased to have the relationship with Aston in terms of its role in the city, but also some of the and the accolades it's received over recent months and years. It was last year awarded the Guardian's University a Year Award in recognition for its work on employability, equality and sustainability. And earlier this month, Aston was ranked second in the country for its work on social mobility by the Higher Education Policy Institute. So well done, Alec, and your team. In terms of the event this evening, the plan is that Anneliese will speak for around 20 or 25 minutes, and then we should have around 30 to 40 minutes for some questions. But at this point, I'll hand you over to Alec.
Thank you very much, Richard. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to Aston for this evening's lecture. Whilst, of course, the current COVID-19 restrictions mean that we can't hold this meeting in person, we have seen over the past years that these online public lectures such as this have been very successful, due in part to the fact that people aren't required to find their way to the campus on a cold evening in March, but are able to participate from much broader a field. So while something is inevitably lost by not being able to gather together, and we all miss that, there is also much to be said for being able to broadcast this lecture to a larger group of people through the online platforms that we can employ. And all of our guests tonight are warmly welcomed to this lecture. I'm delighted that we're able to host this evening's lecture in conjunction with the Labour Finance and Industry Group, and it's a particular pleasure to welcome, or perhaps to welcome back, tonight's guest speaker, Anneliese Dodds. Anneliese is no stranger to Aston, having previously held a senior lectureship in public policy before she was elected to the European Parliament in 2014. And indeed, Anneliese still holds an honorary professorship in public policy at Aston. Anneliese was elected to the House of Commons in 2017 as the MP for Oxford. She served in the Shadow Treasury team as Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury Group from 2017 to 2020, when she was appointed Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer by Keir Starmer in April 2020. Tonight, Anneliese will be setting out her thoughts and strategies about her response to the economic challenges we currently face. It is clearly a critical time for the UK economy, and important decisions need to be taken that will not only shape our short-term economic recovery from COVID-19, but as the title suggests, rebuild the foundations for a better, more secure economy. I'm therefore delighted to hand over to Anneliese for what I'm sure will be an interesting and thought-provoking evening. Anneliese.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Alec, and many thanks to Richard as well, and of course to Martin from the technical support team. And I'm really grateful to him and to all of you for your patience and still being with us after this. I'm sure this won't be the first time that many of us have experienced IT difficulties, probably won't be the last either, but very, very grateful that the audience has stayed with us. And of course, I'm very grateful to Aston, and it's a real pleasure to be back here at Aston, even if only virtually, of course, rather than in person. As was mentioned by Alec, I spent a number of years at Aston teaching and researching in what was then the School of Languages and Social Sciences. And it was really inspiring to be part of an institution which was so strongly committed to its students, who reflected then as now the diversity of the West Midlands, the rest of the UK, and indeed the world. And it was also a real honour, I have to say, to be part of an institution that continually faced outwards, whether that be in its commitment to upskill local young people, to work with local and regional industry, or to collaborate with researchers from right across the world. So really lovely to be back at Aston virtually, and fantastic to be with LFIG as well. And obviously Richard has described the role of LFIG. I've been aware of it for many, many years. It really has provided that essential link between the leadership of Labour and really the cutting edge thinking in business, in society, and the third sector, in academia, around how our economy can change for the better, how we can build that stronger, more secure economy right up and down the country. And really pleased above all that we're here together in the West Midlands and with Richard, because I know he and others have been absolutely pivotal in the West Midlands LFIG organisation. As Alec mentioned, I want tonight to talk about our economic recovery from this extraordinary crisis that we've all been through. And that recovery will come in two stages, two interconnected stages. The first stage, as we know, includes the immediate steps that a responsible government should be taking to secure the foundations for our recovery as quickly as possible, to get us back on the path to growth, to get people back into work, and to minimise economic scarring. And then the second stage must involve a much longer term vision for the kind of economy and the kind of country we want to be in the decade to come. And that means looking at where our economy failed to operate at full strength going into the crisis and learning from that. And it also means looking ahead to the challenges and opportunities to come and being ready for them. Let me start with those short-term measures, which are really what we need to see from government currently, what we needed to see from the Chancellor at the start of the month. And what we needed at the recent budget was a plan for immediate growth. We needed a government straining every sinew to spur on economic activity, to get businesses investing and hiring again, and to inject confidence into our economy. That's what a Labour budget would have delivered, a relentless focus on jobs and growth. First, we would have listened to the myriad of calls from economic experts. Now is not the time for fiscal consolidation, for immediate tax rises or cuts in spending. From the IMF and the OECD to the CBI, there's been a clear consensus that what we need right now is to get confidence and demand back, to go all out for growth, while we're still only just emerging from the grip of the pandemic. But we didn't see the current government listening to that consensus. Instead, at the end of the month, we'll see families right across the country hit with a council tax hike and public sector workers hit with a real terms pay cut. Incredibly, that even includes a real terms pay cut for our NHS heroes, snuck out the day after the budget. And in 6 months' time, just as unemployment is set to peak at over 2 million people, the government's set to cut £20 a week from social security. And then this time next year, the government's planning to squeeze family finances further still by freezing income tax thresholds. All of that will be taking place well before businesses will start paying at that higher rate of corporation tax announced at the budget. That's not just spectacularly unfair, it's also economically illiterate. If we take money out of people's pockets right now, they won't spend it with small businesses or on our high streets, and the recovery will be slower. The economic scarring will be deeper. The same, of course, is true of corporate finances as well. Through no fault of their own, many businesses right across the country have had to take on a huge amount of debt over the past year. For many smaller businesses, this has been completely new, taking on debt for the first time, having previously funded themselves through cash flow or informal financing arrangements. Debt repayments will now be a major feature of their business models for the foreseeable future. Now, forcing businesses to start making debt repayments before they're back on their feet will squeeze the amount they have to invest to grow and to take on new staff. For some, it could mean going to the wall. Hundreds of thousands of businesses across the country are on a knife edge. If they falter off or fail, it's not just a tragedy for the owners who lose their livelihoods and the staff who will lose their jobs. It will also damage the recovery and hold us all back. It's a completely false economy for the Chancellor to leave these businesses high and dry. A new analysis that Labour published today reveals that 750,000 businesses have low or no confidence that they will survive just the next 3 months. That's over 2 million jobs at risk. In the West Midlands, 1 in every 3 firms is in that precarious position. The government can't claim a lack of opportunities to act. Several organisations, from the FSB to the City UK, have proposed alternative ways of dealing with this debt burden. We in Labour agree. We've urged the government to consider converting bounce back loans into a tax liability, more like student loans. That way, businesses only start to pay them back when they return to profitability. But sadly, on this issue, the Chancellor's been asleep at the wheel. His so-called pay-as-you-grow scheme might make for a good soundbite, but it's misleading. There's no link to growth at all. He simply shifted deadlines back by a few months. While that might help some businesses, the fact is we're still on course to see billions of pounds of public money written off in unpaid loans because the Chancellor is refusing to act. The pay-as-you-grow scheme barely puts a dent in the £27 billion the Office for Budget Responsibility expects the government will ultimately have to write off from these COVID-related loans. So a Labour budget would have ensured that families and businesses alike had the breathing space they needed to get back on their feet and fuel the recovery. It would also have harnessed the power of public investment to boost the recovery. Timing is critical here. Bringing forward £30 billion of planned capital spending into the next 18 months could support the creation of up to 400,000 new jobs right now, when we most need them. That money could be invested in retrofitting homes to bring down energy costs, in charging infrastructure to enable the rollout of electric vehicles, in the decarbonisation of energy-intensive industries, in sectors like offshore wind and community solar and hydro. In doing so, we would stimulate the recovery and accelerate our transition to net zero at the same time. It's an approach being taken by our peers across the world. Incredibly though, the Chancellor actually cut £500 million of planned capital investment compared to this time last year. And his botched Green Homes grant scheme, the flagship policy of his so-called plan for jobs in July, has been rolled out so ineffectively it's actually cost jobs. With less than 2 weeks to go, the government has only managed to spend less than 10% of the funding it had allocated to that scheme. The government could roll that money over to next year while urgently fixing the problems with the programme and meeting demand that's clearly there. Instead, the Chancellor's clawing the money back. The whole thing has been a shambles, one that I worry has been handled so badly it risks setting back the green agenda this year of all years, the year we host COP26. Now, as well as stimulating the creation of new jobs, we also needed action to help those who've lost their jobs back into work, especially to help those at the start of their careers, for whom a spell out of work now can slash by a fifth what they can earn during the rest of their life. Going into the budget, over 500,000 under 25s were out of work. Yet the Chancellor's much vaunted Kickstart scheme was only helping 1 in every 100 eligible young people. Nearly 300,000 people have been out of work for more than a year, and yet the Restart programme aimed at this group doesn't even begin until July and won't be operating at full capacity until this time next year. That's inadequate to the scale of the challenge. Instead, a Labour budget would have made a real jobs promise to those young people that they would all be in work, education or training within 6 months, and we would have committed to end the scourge of long-term unemployment by ensuring that no one was involuntarily out of work 12 months after losing their job. We've shown how we could achieve this speedily, responsibly, and for the sake of those unemployed people who desperately need help. These actions are needed urgently to secure the foundations of our recovery right now, protecting family finances and easing the debt pressure on businesses so they have the confidence to spend and to invest, to get the economy firing on all cylinders, targeted public investment to tackle both the jobs crisis and the climate crisis, and a helping hand for all those who've lost their jobs so they get back into work as soon as possible. These were the actions we needed at the budget, but which were lacking. It's not too late, and I urge the Chancellor and the Government to think again. Now, as well as steps to get us out of the immediate crisis, we also needed to think, as I said, about that second stage, the challenges and opportunities of the next decade. The pandemic has, of course, completely changed the outlook for our economy, but it's not the only force shaping the future. The tectonic plates of global trade are shifting. China's rise continues, as does that of India. The US, as we know, has a new administration. The UK has newly left the EU, and the EU itself is contemplating its role in the world. The disputes over vaccine distribution in recent days have brought into sharp focus the questions that are likely to dominate future trade policy: how to balance openness and flexibility with domestic resilience, how to hope for the best but be prepared for the worst. At the same time, technological advance continues apace, accelerated by COVID-19 and the changes it has necessitated in working practices. There are opportunities here to begin to address our long-standing gaps in productivity growth, but considerable risks for those who may get left behind. The demographics of our country are changing too. We're becoming an older society, one in which the balance between those in work and those in retirement is shifting. That has implications for public services and especially for social care. This last year has shone the harshest of spotlights on how neglected that sector has been for far too long. And of course, the existential threat of the climate crisis hangs over all of this. The United Nations has warned that we have less than 10 years to avert the worst impacts of catastrophic climate change. We cannot lose focus on tackling that challenge for a moment. Contending with these multiple challenges requires a government that is up to the task, a government that is strategic and thinks for the long term, a government that is ambitious for the future of our country and the people who live here. Sadly, the last 11 years have shown us that Conservative governments are not up to those challenges. A decade of short-termism and irresponsibility left us woefully unprepared when the crisis hit. Our economy lacked resilience at both the national level and the level of individual households. We went into the pandemic as one of the most unequal countries in Europe, a country where wages had flatlined for a decade, where 1 in 4 households had less than £100 in savings, where 3.6 million people were in insecure work, where public services were already stretched to breaking point and where vital stocks of protective equipment had been run down. It's little wonder that we've gone on to have the worst economic crisis of any major economy. And all of this was pursued in the name of an economic policy that failed even on its own terms. A widely discredited approach to the public finances that dampened growth after the global financial crisis, but which still saw the national debt balloon from £1 trillion to £1.8 trillion, and an unfounded faith that £95 billion worth of corporation tax cuts would spur on investment and growth, but which actually left us with the lowest level of business investment in the G7, a philosophy that's now been spectacularly abandoned by the Chancellor, with no acknowledgement of the damage done in the meantime. Even where the Conservatives have claimed to be investing for the long term, they haven't walked the walk. In 2015, they promised 200,000 new starter homes. Not a single one was ever built. In 2014, the then Chancellor announced Northern Powerhouse Rail. Since then, the Conservatives have re-announced or recommitted to major rail projects in the north more than 60 times, and not a single spade has been put in the ground. In Aston University's own backyard, people are still waiting for the Midlands Metropolitan Hospital, currently running 4 years over deadline and set to cost twice the original budget. That's the Conservative track record on long-term investment. A headline, a photo call, and far too little else. And that looks set to continue. The industrial strategy has now been mothballed, and in its place we've got 8 free ports and a pot of centralised funding for towns and regions to fight over. That's not a plan. That's not the long-term vision our country needs. A Labour government would instead take a responsible approach, acting in the long-term interests of the whole country. As Chancellor, I would lift the horizon of our economic policy making, moving beyond the current 5-year cycle or less to look 10 and 20 years ahead. I'd require a relentless focus on value for public money, not just fixating on how much money is spent, but how well it is spent. That focus on value for money would include requesting the National Audit Office to produce an annual report, bringing together its assessments of the effectiveness of public spending. And I'd commit to act on the recommendations within that report. And where public money is being invested across the UK, a future Labour government would ensure that investment had strong conditions attached to provide local jobs and opportunities for local businesses in the supply chain. This Labour difference is already apparent where Labour is in power. In Wales, Mark Drakeford's government has developed a new economic contract where businesses seeking government support must commit to fair work, reducing their carbon footprint and promoting health and learning in the workplace. In London, Sadiq Khan has introduced the Good Work Standard, where employers that commit to go above and beyond legal requirements concerning their treatment of staff stand a better chance of winning public contracts. On May the 6th, voters can put their faith in those great leaders and give them the chance to finish the job. And here in the West Midlands, they can back Liam Byrne, who I know would take the same strategic and long-term approach that this region so desperately needs. We should also be looking for opportunities to go further, in particular to see where government can act to enable relationships between our great universities like Aston, industry, trade unions and the local community. The Conservatives seem to believe that innovation only happens when government stands back and waits to see what happens. But as Labour, we know that government can play a vital role in removing the barriers that exist to innovation. We've seen that during this crisis, whether in the partnership between Oxford University and AstraZeneca or during the ventilator challenge, where the Centre for Advanced Manufacturing worked with major manufacturers, trade unions and government to achieve what had seemed virtually impossible to an incredibly fast timetable. We stand on the brink of a new era. The 2020s could be the decade when we define a new ambitious path for the UK, leading the way in tackling the climate crisis, championing an open but responsible approach to international trade, harnessing the power of new technologies and innovation to spread growth and opportunity right across the country, rebuilding the foundations of our economy and our public services for a better, more secure future. You only need to look at the last decade to see that the Conservatives are just not capable of rising to that challenge. You can't trust the rebuilding of our foundations to the party that weakened them in the first place. You can't place the hopes for our country's future in the hands of a party that never seems to be able to look more than 5 minutes ahead. It's Labour, under new leadership, that can genuinely secure our economy and rebuild our country after this crisis and into the years ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anneliese, for that very incisive critique of the current government's approach, and also for laying out so clearly the plans that you would have to rebuild an economy and help us transition over the long term in a very, very different way, which is more considered, with much as an emphasis on infrastructure than there is investing in people. For those of you who are listening in, please post some questions. A number of coming through now, and I will want to draw on some of those in a second, Anneliese. But just before we do, I'm picking up on one of the points raised already. Reflecting on the experiences that you've had in Westminster over the last 12 months or so through COVID, there's a more general issue about what your view is as a consequence of the country's response to that around devolution and the extent to which policy interventions going forward are best made in Whitehall and Westminster as opposed to the places that need to deliver services on the ground and reach out to the people who need them most.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed for that, Richard. And I think this is absolutely critical for that stronger economic future that we need to see across the UK, and indeed for the future of our public services and so much else, because I think we've seen during this crisis many of those lower levels of government, I would argue, rising magnificently actually to the challenge. I mean, obviously, because Labour is in power in Wales, we know a lot about what's taken place there, and it was very interesting to see the auditor of government provided services in Wales being very, very supportive indeed of the way that, for example, Wales dealt with the challenge of test and trace, where from the very beginning they adopted a much more decentralised approach. They worked with local authorities, local public health teams, provided it through a public approach, but very much joined up with all other organisations that they needed to be working with. And from the very beginning, that approach was extremely effective, actually, compared to the much more centralised approach that we saw coming from the Westminster Conservative government. I think we've got a number of other examples, actually, where we saw whether it was individual local authorities working with, I know in my case in Oxfordshire, working with the local LEP, the business community, local trade unions and charities to make sure that support got where it was needed, both to businesses and to vulnerable individuals, or whether we're talking about the combined mayoral authorities, a number of them working in a really innovative way actually to deliver support during this period. I think we understand now what works. What works is when there's a clear longer term understanding about respective responsibilities, where there's respect between parties, where there's an attempt to create an equal dialogue. What does not work is the kind of situation that we had particularly last year, where there was allegedly a negotiation between the centre and different local areas to receive support. It wasn't a genuine negotiation. All areas received the same amount of money actually at the end of the day. It seemed sadly to be more about a blame game, really, rather than having that genuine approach, bringing the strength of local action into the response. So we must learn from what's worked during this crisis, and that means having that more respectful relationship into the future, more clarity and a much longer term view on this. And obviously that feeds into all those debates about, the Towns Fund, Levelling Up Fund, etc., where we've got these pots of money that are pitting towns and regions against each other, rather than having a much more joined up and bottom up approach.
Thank you, Anneliese. I'd now like to thank you, Anneliese. I'd now like to pick up some questions from those that have been listening in. I'll frame the first few around two themes that are coming through quite strongly around government support for business, during the last 12 months and going forward, and also many questions coming through on green growth and the green agenda and the green economy. The first question I want to pick up here on support for business is from Tony Carroll, who says the French government have supported their aerospace industry with £13 billion worth of funding support. Here in Britain, Rolls-Royce has £6 billion of loans and face the most difficult period in the last 50 years. What would Labour's response be in terms of supporting some of the businesses most adversely affected by the impact of COVID?
Yeah, thanks very much, and really appreciate. Can you hear me? Sorry,
Yes.
You can. Excellent. Yeah, sorry, I got a strange message on my my Teams account there. Apologies. Thanks very much indeed, Tony. I think that's an absolutely critical question, and our view from the very beginning of this crisis was that government needed to act to preserve economic capacity, to ensure that we would have that, particularly, industrial infrastructure, to be able to be recovering from the crisis as speedily as possible. And I'm very concerned about aerospace in particular here, because actually that industry, as we all know, it's one where we don't need to just be focusing on the individual household names that we'll all be aware of, whether it's, Rolls-Royce or Airbus or so many others. It's also the supply chain of so many other businesses that are linked to them. And of course, in a number of regions of the UK, that employment is incredibly significant as an overall proportion of the workforce, especially at a relatively skilled level compared to the other forms of employment. Now, in the UK, we've had a frustrating situation where for a long period we were promised that there would be some kind of a deal for aviation, also that there would be a joined up approach to aerospace. We haven't seen that, and we've seen, unfortunately, jobs being lost in the UK, while, Tony's right to mention the French case, but also in Germany, where there's been a much more joined up approach, where it's been combined actually with that focus on decarbonisation and the fuels and technologies of the future. And really, I believe that we're really missing a trick here for the future of the UK's economy. And I was really privileged to visit Airbus's facility in North Wales, and where they're building what they're calling the wings of the future there to make planes much more energy effective, and really exciting engineering that's going on. But I'm very concerned that those kinds of facilities, because of the lack of that engaged support, will be struggling. And that's not just to do with the lack of a sectoral approach. I think it's also because of government's approach to the furlough scheme as well, where they're obviously switching it off at exactly the same time across every industry without notice being paid to the impact of health-based restrictions or heavy restrictions on demand that may well be impacting on aerospace for really some time to come. So that longer term focus, I would say, really is needed, especially when it comes to sectors like aerospace.
Okay. Thank you, Anneliese. Thank you, Anneliese. Moving on to the green agenda and some of the challenges we face there. I've got a question from Sandy that says, an all-out agenda of growth has to be focused on green growth. We have dreadful energy inefficiency in our housing stock that needs to be redesigned. What's Labour's response to that in terms of how it can build a policy programme around it and create jobs in the process? Also, I think just an additional question, if I may ask on the back of that, Anneliese, is how would Labour transition the economy? Yep, there are some specific issues here around housing, but how would Labour seek to move the economy from where we are now to one which is dealing more effectively with climate change?
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. First of all, on Sandy's question, he's absolutely right that unfortunately we have housing that's highly energy inefficient, that's often cold, that's expensive to heat right across the UK. So if we had a really intensive retrofitting programme, that would be supportive of new jobs right across our country. It would obviously, as Sandy said as well, help us to face up to that net zero challenge at the same time. And it's a tremendous frustration to us in Labour that we're not seeing that commitment to such a programme currently by the UK government. Again, we see it being adopted in many other countries. It's not being delivered here. We set out in a Green Economic Recovery report that we did last year how government could act right now to be supporting that retrofitting programme that's so desperately needed. The measures that have been put in place, in our view, are far too limited to be facing up to the scale of this challenge. Now is a time when investing in this sector really would make sense. It would make sense for those householders, and it would make sense for jobs and for our environment as well. And it's a real frustration that the Green Homes Grant scheme that I mentioned before, which was meant to be a flagship scheme supporting job creation in the green economy, in the area of housing and energy efficiency and production, that it's been managed so poorly that it is actually losing jobs. This isn't rocket science. You know, we know as a country how to deliver these kinds of schemes. There's enormous appetite for it right across the country. Actually, I was talking to Rich and Alec earlier about the fact that I was in Birmingham yesterday. There is so much commitment to this agenda within the West Midlands. There's so much that could be done around this, but we don't see that action being taken now. Around the transition more broadly, I think we could talk about this for the whole evening, actually. I mean, we need that focus on those areas of capital investment and activity where we can have, you know, relatively quick wins that are also employment supporting, and where it makes sense to be bringing forward capital spending. So retrofitting other areas around, for example, charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, you know, a number of other cases where bringing forward that capital investment would make sense now. In addition, we of course need to be supporting those highly energy intensive industries in the UK to make that transition. You know, it's very, very hard for a number of them to do that right now. You think about ceramics, for example, steel, obviously, where there's a lot of discussion and debate right now. We have the opportunity, particularly with green hydrogen, but with other forms of energy that are being developed as well, that are much lower carbon than traditional forms. We have the opportunity to be making that transition at pace, but we need to both ensure that the right financing is there, but also that we have the appropriate regulation and planning system as well. You know, again, I was really privileged to undertake a visit to the LEVC plant in near Coventry with Liam Byrne, our candidate, some time ago, talking to people there. You know, enormous passion to be driving forward the circular economy. Makes business sense, of course, as well, but the planning system is not set up in the UK to enable that process of co-location that we need to see to be driving forward this agenda. We don't have integration across different types of planning when it comes to, you know, the energy system, water use and land use as well. And actually, sadly, the government is removing some of the levers that would be necessary in order to ensure that we have those planning levers for the future. So, you know, there's a huge amount that needs to be done, that we can do, and that our country can really achieve economically with, as well as environmental terms. And the time to act really is now, with that new partnership between government and business that's so desperately needed.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Anneliese. Arjun Ray asks, the Chancellor seems to have ignored young people in his budget, and since young people will struggle to enter the labour market over the coming years, can you outline a bit more detail how you would propose to support young people if Labour were in government?
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Arjun, for that question. And we saw actually today coming through some of those statistics about the extent to which job losses have been really heavily concentrated amongst younger people, and incredibly difficult for people coming into the labour market right now. Of course, it's all of those jobs in the kind of the areas of hospitality, leisure, tourism that so often young people would have been moving into that aren't available to them at this stage. So we really do need to see a concentrated focus on ensuring that opportunities are there. We know what happens when they are not provided. It's very clear, the research evidence, I referred to it briefly in my speech. We know from that evidence that when young people have particularly a sustained period out of work, as well as out of education or training, that can have a reductive impact on the earnings for the rest of their life, up to 20% reduction on average in what they're able to earn across their life course. So we need to be gripping onto this now. We've been setting out ways in which we can have that, what we've called a jobs promise for young people, how we could be delivering that promise, saying to young people that they shouldn't be able to pass 6 months out of work, education or training without being offered a job, education or training. We've indicated how we could deliver that. Johnny Reynolds, who's our Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, I've been working with him around delivering that, around saying how we could put it into place. You know, it really is about getting rid of those barriers to action, joining up different schemes, making them locally and regionally rooted so that that support is there. So using unspent apprenticeship levy money, for example, getting rid of the barriers for employers to be involved in the Kickstart scheme. Far too many of them. It's far too hard for employers to access that scheme. Really opening up those opportunities for training. I mean, we've got, for example, significant vacancies currently in areas like social care, but there's no clear training pathway for young people who might be wanting to go into that sector out of unemployment. You know, there are ways to achieve this jobs promise. Instead, currently we have a guarantee on paper, but no guarantee in reality. As I said, at the time of the budget, only 1 in every 100 longer term unemployed young people in a Kickstart placement. Now it's about 1 in every 50. Still far too few long-term young unemployed people getting that support that they need.
Okay, thank you. Wait for this. Thank you very much, Anneliese. Moving away from young people to the role of education, and particularly higher education, Patricia asks, what role do you envision for the role that higher education should play as a sector in the economy and our recovery going forward?
Well, I think it's an incredibly important question. I mean, I was privileged to work as an academic for many, many years, so I know that higher education is about so much more than its economic impact. Obviously, it's about a huge number of different things, about culture, about human potential, about how we all relate to each other, about understanding society and the world much better. But equally, it does have a very, very significant economic impact for the UK, one that was growing before this crisis, one that's incredibly important for our exports, and that's in a situation where, you know, the UK's level of exports has been quite concerning in relation to our level of imports, I would argue, for quite a long time. So we really do need to be ensuring that we support higher education into the future, but we haven't been viewing, I would say, our universities as part of that industrial strategy that we need to see for the future. Of course, this has now been intensified by the fact that the government doesn't seem to want to have an industrial strategy at all. They don't seem to want to even use that phrase. I think universities will be critical for the future. I think ensuring that we still have that very, very strong offer for international students, for example, will be very important. I think ensuring that we are still a research powerhouse will be absolutely critical. I mean, it will be so important for all of our health, for example, if you look at the biomedical research that goes on at our universities, for technology, for our industry, but very, very important in financial terms, of course, as well, for our country. So we really do need to be, I think, changing the mindset of government, and particularly the Treasury, when it comes to the role of universities for the future. And I would just say finally that, you know, that aspect that I touched on in my speech, that aspect of partnership, I think is really critically important. I mean, I saw it obviously from the inside when I was at Aston, which is a university that really is open to the surrounding area. It works a lot with neighbouring industry, as so many different universities do, as well as with, you know, trade unions, charities, many other organisations. I've seen myself in the city that I am very proud to represent half of as well. Of course, how Oxford University worked with AstraZeneca in genuine partnership, and it's been so exciting to see that partnership where, you know, it really has been a situation of joint working with the local National Health Service, of course, as well, and, you know, volunteers and really the whole of the city of Oxford. So let's build on that partnership to the future, really celebrate what's been so successful during this period, and make sure that we do far more to encourage it into the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Anneliese. We've got an interesting question which might lighten the mood a bit. I just, if I can find it. Hold on a second. Yeah, just to lighten the mood a bit, if it's possible at this stage. Slightly different question from Zaim to the rest of them. How, being in such an important role as being Shadow Chancellor, how have you balanced all the pressures on your time, from you know, family to being having responsibilities for constituency, and performing such a high-profile job as Shadow Chancellor?
Oh, well, that's a lovely question. Thank you very much, Zaim. I have to say that I think the challenges in balancing workload that have impacted on politicians really pale into insignificance when we look at the situation for so many others, of course, not least our public service workers who are still there at the front line, and you know, a lot of the time having to work very unsocial hours. So I think, you know, in many ways us politicians have had it very easy, and of course we've had secure employment as well compared to those who've really been through a very, very difficult time employment wise. So I certainly haven't had anything to complain about. I mean, it's been, I think, a peculiar year for all of us, hasn't it? I've had to do so much of these kinds of events literally in my loft, which is where I'm talking to you from now, in our former council house where I live with my family in Oxford. And kind of missing that human contact, I think, is something that we're all really noticing, and you know, really desperate to get back to having more of that contact. I have to say, in terms of balancing different tasks, I'm incredibly grateful to the people who work with me. So I have a very small team. I have to say, it's, with 3 people, it's rather smaller than the civil servants who staff the Treasury, but we do our best collectively in the Shadow Treasury team, and of course my constituency staff as well, who do a brilliant job. And it really has been a very challenging time for them, of course, because they've had to adjust to working remotely as well, which has been you know, really quite difficult to get used to, and they've done a magnificent job. I really would want to put that on the record, how grateful I am to them for all that they've done during this period. In terms of kind of balancing it with family, I mean, it's, you know, it's been quite interesting. I was actually, while we were speaking, I was really hoping that the strains of a very, very, very beginner level violin weren't going to be feeding through into the conversation. Hopefully you missed that. Of course, I have to say publicly that it sounds amazing, but the reality isn't quite there yet. But it's been lovely, I suppose, to, in some ways, be with my family much more, and, you know, so grateful for the opportunity to do that. But equally, of course, that's been because of the dreadful times that we've all been through, and still continuing for so many people. And of course, we are a year after the first lockdown, and you know, a lot of memories, very difficult ones for a lot of people, I think, coming through today.
Okay. Thank you, Anneliese. And that was a well, it's not a technical question, I think a very important one, because the last 12 months or so, lots of people have been facing many challenges about how to balance all the demands in their lives, and how they can get on with things. This is an anonymous one, but it's picking up actually, you know, something behind you on your bookshelf, a book you've got behind you. Someone says that I can see behind you on your bookshelf you have the 5 giants. How can we respond to today's challenge with the 21st century beverage plan under New Labour? Under New Labour, it was education, education, education. What will be the emphasis for Labour going forward in the 2020s?
Well, that's a huge question, and well spotted, by the way, whoever saw that. I have to say the books there were not strategically placed in any way, but there's been quite a lot of psychoanalysis apparently that's gone on about the different ones in there. But I think ultimately, you know, it's a very good question, because of course those 5 giants that were identified were then faced up to in policy terms, with the creation, obviously, of the welfare state and all of the action that came afterwards. I would say that really now is a time when, in a similar way, we've seen really I suppose the fault lines, the divisions and the frailties of our economy, our public services, and particularly I would say also our labour market, really during this crisis. And we really need to face up to those challenges into the future. Obviously, we're working on this right now as a Labour Party, how we can recover, but then much more strongly rebuild with a far more secure economy and far more resilient public services for the future across all of our country. But I think, you know, there really are many very modern challenges that we need to focus on that, as I say, have been indicated through this crisis. I think the very unequal impact of the disease has reflected, sadly, the appalling inequalities that still exist in our country. And people, I'm sure, will be aware of Michael Marmot's work here, where he's really focused on how, you know, all of those problems that, you know, certainly those of us who are in the Labour Party are very well aware of around housing inequalities, around pre-existing health issues that are particularly intense, of course, dependent on income, but also people's Black and minority ethnic status as well, people's disability status as well. All of that really has been put into sharp relief, sadly, during this crisis. We must face up to it. I think we must also face up to some of those incredibly precarious elements of our labour market. As I said, also, we've had so many problems in the UK around supporting people's incomes. And a big part of that has been because of the fact that we have so many, what I would call precariously employed people in the UK. 3.6 million people in insecure work before this crisis started. Now, we must be facing up to that for the future, because it has so many negative impacts for those people and for their families. It's so hard to raise a family under the kind of work pressures that many, many people in the UK face when they do not know from one day to the next, for example, exactly how many hours they're going to be working, what they're going to be paid. Very, very hard to have a stable family life on that basis. So, many giants that will need slaying in the future if we're going to build towards that that much, much brighter and stronger UK that we need to see.
Thank you, Anneliese. Andy Limer asks, what support would Labour provide for small businesses, particularly those that haven't been supported by the government to date, and where their owners have put their life savings and their assets into those businesses and are putting their livelihoods at risk? That's aligned to a further question that's been asked anonymously by someone who attends Aston Business School, which is about Labour's plans to finance the paying off of the debt for this, and particularly around your approach to progressive taxation.
Wow, so all really big and important questions. I mean, first of all, with Andy's question, I think this is incredibly important, and it's something that I feel very personally, because I guess I have a small business background. So my dad was a small businessman. He worked 6-day week for 30 years with his small business. And I know how he would have been feeling if he'd been put in the position of many small business people that I've talked to through this crisis, where, as Andy suggested in that question, they've put their life and soul into their business. It's not just a matter of keeping themselves afloat financially, or even, making some money and building up that business. It's something that really is very important to them personally. They're very concerned about their staff. They're concerned about the impacts on their community and local area if they're not able to keep their business going. And it's been a really tough time. And I think we've seen, unfortunately, I would say, a lack of recognition and understanding of the impact on small businesses, really, a lot of the time from government, I would argue. So, we've seen so much chopping and changing around the support schemes. And, I kind of made a point of saying in Parliament at one point that I've been talking to a guy who runs what was until recently an extremely successful and growing restaurant in Delhi, actually in the northwest of England. And he was saying that he didn't know one weekend whether he was going to be able to open the next week, whether he was going to be able to have support for his staff at 67% of their previous wage. I think it was 77% or 80%, because there was no clarity then around the support schemes. And that kind of uncertainty is really damaging. And it's actually led to quite a lot of people that I've spoken to saying they're not sure if they can continue in the future with that kind of stress, particularly owners of small businesses and managers. So we do need to see a different approach that very much is looking at these issues from the perspective of small business, understanding them far more. I would say that the government needs to stop with its kind of computer says no mentality around issues like support for owner directors, where actually I think there have been quite potentially effective schemes that have been put forward that would have helped people in those situations to keep going. But then I think it needs to be viewing small businesses as part of the solution for our economic recovery. We saw, for example, at the budget, the super deduction being announced. That's something obviously for generally larger businesses because of the corporation tax regime. Well, where's the incentive for those smaller businesses to be investing in the future. And that's one of the reasons why we set out that different approach to the COVID loans, the bounce back loans, saying, well, if we could be saying to small businesses, if you've taken on a bounce back loan, yes, you will eventually have to pay it back, but you'll be able to push that back until when you're profitable again, then they might have the confidence to be taking more people on, to actually be creating those new jobs that we need to see, to be investing in plant and so forth, and improvements to their physical capital. So we do need to be, I think, having a new mentality there. And then on that question about how we will finance the debt that's been accrued during this period, and what's Labour's approach to a progressive tax system, I think first of all, we need to acknowledge the fact that the most important thing for government to be focused on right now really is going for growth. And as I said in my speech, I feel like we haven't had that laser-like focus on going for growth, on keeping people in work, keeping businesses going, getting people back into work, giving the confidence for consumers to spend and for businesses to invest. That's what's needed, because without that strong support for growth, we will see potentially a slower recovery back into the future. We won't actually be seeing the tax base growing back again into the future. And we already see those increases in taxation on council tax, for example, reduction in public spending in a number of areas coming in really quite quickly. That is not the approach being taken in many other countries. So the UK is quite an outlier here, going against the international consensus. I don't think that's the right approach to be taken. Now, in the longer term, of course, we need to be aware of the fact that the interest rate regime could change. I think it's really important that we're sanguine about this, that we're having our eyes wide open, that the costs of covering debt interest in particular, dependent on what happens with the interest rate regime, that they could increase into the future. We need to be prepared for that. But right now, the focus must be on growth. And then I would say into the future, we must ensure that our economy is more resilient. As I said in my speech, national debt actually increased massively over the last 10 years, from 1 trillion to 1.8 trillion. Yet during that period, the government failed every single legally binding target that it set itself on debt and the deficit. So the approach was not the right one. It was far too short-termist. It wasn't focused on creating the preconditions for sustainable growth, and indeed the preconditions to reduce the amount of public spending that's necessary. One of the most significant things that's taken place in public spending on social security over the last few years has been the increasing amount of it that's had to go into support for housing costs. Now, if we faced up to those housing challenges as a country and made sure we had that genuinely affordable housing provision and social housing, then we would be reducing that cost for the future. But because we've had such a short-termist approach, I would say from successive Conservative-led governments, we've not been able to bring those costs down. So we need to have, I would say, fiscal rules, and I am a supporter of fiscal rules, an unabashed supporter of them, but we need to have the right ones. We need to have rules that will be focused over a longer term, that will enable us to be reducing those costs for the future, investing in our country's economic future as well. I think that's the way to be facing up to those challenges. Oh.
Sorry, I was going to at some point. Thank you very much. Moving on to perhaps the last 2 or 3 questions. I'll link 2 together. One is from Jeremy Johnson, who asks about your views on HS2 in particular. It costs such a lot of money. Given changes in people's work patterns going forward, or expected changes post-COVID, should we be continuing to commit to HS2 in the way that we have been so far? And that's aligned to another question that's come in around levelling up, and maybe you're able to link the 2 answers. But on levelling up, is it a pipe dream, or is it something that is real and the government are truly committed to?
Oh, well, two really important questions. I mean, first of all, to Jeremy's question, Labour's been very clear that we have been very concerned about, for example, the cost overruns that have really bedeviled the HS2 programme for a very long time. But equally, we do need to face up to the fact that we have a dearth of high-speed rail in the UK compared to many other nations. We do need to be tackling that into the future. And so I do think it's important that when we have these major infrastructure projects, that we have that longer term perspective in mind. And it's for that reason that, you know, Labour, although we have those concerns around cost overruns, as I said, that, you know, we're not standing in the way of achieving that greater high-speed connectivity. I would say, however, I mean, Jeremy is right to raise the fact that we're seeing transport patterns changing, and this needs to be part of a longer term strategy, of course, for transport connections into the future. I am concerned that we don't seem to have that approach from government currently. We see, for example, new railway lines being put in which are not electrified from the beginning, far more expensive to retrofit them and make them electric into the future than doing that from the very beginning. So we need to have a far more joined up approach right across the piece on transport. I'm sure we could talk about this for a very, very long time. When it comes to levelling up, well, it certainly is achievable in terms of ensuring that we see a reduction in both inequalities between regions and indeed within them. But do I believe that the current government is committed to the measures required to get to that reduction in regional inequality? Unfortunately, I don't. I mean, what does that agenda seem to amount to at the moment? Well, the announcement of 8 free ports and some different pots of money that pit towns and regions against each other. I don't think that's the way to actually be developing that sustainable growth. You know, I can fully understand why different areas are bidding for those different forms of support. Of course, they're doing that because there isn't really another game in town right now. But instead of that, we need to have that much longer term focus. We need to be really building on the excellent work that I would say is happening in many of our combined authority areas. It's happening in Labour run Wales as well. That's happening in London, where you've got a joined up approach to this, where there's a longer term plan that's looking at these issues in the round. So the transport connection issues, the issues around, for example, other preconditions of business activity like broadband availability and other forms of business infrastructure, linking that then into skills, the local workforce, and as I say, having that more holistic approach. That's what we believe would be driving genuine levelling up, if I could call it that. And I would just say finally that, you know, you look at the issues that are real problems for lots of people in different parts of the country. The fact that childcare costs have doubled while wages have stagnated. The fact that we don't see those opportunities for further education, for example, in many communities, with the closure of so many colleges after enormous cuts over the years. These are just not being faced up to at all as part of these debates by the Conservative government. And they need to be, because we need to see every part of our country growing into the future if we're going to have that better, more secure future.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Anneliese. I think we'll have to bring the questions to an end there, but I just wanted to finish to say thank you very much. And there's a message from Sir Michael Lyons has just popped up in front of me saying, yeah, it was an inspiring lecture. So let's not waste the opportunity. And Labour's been terribly responsible in its response to COVID, but just ensure you don't lose the radicalism and as you progress on your journey. So thank you very much. I know we're running out of time now, but you covered a lot of ground. I've realised what a hard job it is that you do, answering such a broad range of questions in such detail. At this point, obviously, I wanted to just pass over to Alec, the Vice Chancellor at Aston, to wrap up events.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'd like to firstly, on behalf of all of us, thank Anneliese for her lecture this evening. It is a great pleasure to be able to welcome Anneliese back to Aston, and I'm sure our students would greatly appreciate hearing from her lecturing to them again, but she's got more important work to do at the moment. So can I thank her for her presentation and also thank her for her very frank and honest answers to all the questions that were posed to her. Can I also thank everybody who has participated, both passively and actively. Obviously, those who have been active and have posted questions have added to the discussion, so that's greatly appreciated. I appreciate we had some technical problems earlier in the evening, so I apologise that we were a bit slow in getting underway, but I think the wait was well worth it. So can I once again just acknowledge Richard and LFIG. We greatly appreciate that Aston very much wants to be a forum for debates and discussions on important issues, and tonight is an example of that. So we appreciate the partnership that we have with LFIG, and can I wish everybody a very pleasant evening. Thanks again to Anneliese, thank you to LFIG, and thank you to all of our attendees.
Okay.
Good night.
We made it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.